Life on Earth has been embroiled in a constant arms race since the very beginning, with predators and prey always being selected for their ability to capture food and prevent themselves from becoming food. This video is a highlight reel of the most insane weapons that extinct animals developed, either to take down prey or to bite back, and the horrible ways they could use those weapons to kill you. We'll rank each killing method from 1 to 10, with 1 being merciful and 10 being brutal torture. Speaking of biting, we'll start off by examining the nastiest teeth in natural history. Livyatan melvillei holds the record for the largest teeth of any known animal, not counting tusks. It lived 9 to 10 million years ago and terrorized the oceans, likely feeding on baleen whales and sharks. Each full-size tooth was over a foot long and was thick and deeply rooted, making Livyatan a marine war machine. There are worse ways to go, though. This would likely be pretty quick. Maybe a 6? Livyatan lived with and may have competed with Arctodus megalodon, the mega-toothed shark itself. This ancient shark's chompers dwarfed those of the modern great white, and for good reason. Trophic level testing indicates that the meg occupied a level far higher than even today's apex predators like polar bears and orcas, and some fragmentary specimens like Ragnarok, also known as the Yellowstone hyperpredator, hint at animals well over 100 tons in overall body mass. A 2008 bite force estimate for the meg calculated 182,000 newtons for a 103-ton individual. That was scaling up directly from great whites, and now we know that they weren't as closely related, but it gives a rough idea of how monstrous its bite would have been. The bite alone is a 6, but the psychological trauma of being attacked by a huge shark brings it up to an 8. We have to go to the rivers to find potential rivals. The enormous alligatorid Deinosuchus hatcheri, with specimens ranging from 5 to over 13 tons, may have bit down with over 100,000 newtons of force according to a 2012 study, and has conical teeth like huge tent stakes that would have trapped dinosaurian prey in an inescapable death grip. The giant Cayman Purosaurus from Brazil comes decently close at up to 69,000 newtons. Its broad snout holds a large number of teeth that protrude up to 2 inches from its jaws. A far cry from Livyatan, of course, but more than sufficient to crush the large mammals it lived with. Sarcosuchus, a phyllitosaur from Cretaceous North Africa, superficially resembled a 30-foot gharial. Its teeth were long and thin compared to Deinosuchus and Purosaurus, but far more robust than modern gharials. This animal was clearly a dinosaur eater. Collectively, the big crocs get a 7 for the jump scare factor, but it would be over before too long. Speaking of dinosaurs, land predators had their own monsters to add to the list. Tyrannosaurus rex was equipped with long, thick, banana-shaped teeth with serrated edges designed for blasting through flesh and bone, either immediately killing or crippling whatever unfortunate animal it got its jaws on. For human, we'll give it a 3. He'd explode before he could feel too much pain. Carcharodontosaurs thrived with a different set of specializations. Their teeth were thin and blade-like, perfect for slicing through muscle of the giant sauropods they lived with, but the bigger ones were also in near insta-kill territory for a human. Spinosaurids had conical teeth like crocodilians, and were excellently adapted for gripping enormous, thrashing fish like Onchopristis. If you think hunting fish is easy, try pinning down a beast the size of a car. Its thinner teeth and relatively weaker jaws would make this way more painful and slow, giving it a 7. On the subject, a 2024 paper found that Komodo dragons excel at cutting flesh due to concentrations of iron in the cutting edges of their tooth enamel, and suggests that many theropod dinosaurs did as well. Now that's metal. Dunkleosteus didn't technically have teeth, but I'm including it in this section anyway. Although shrunken from its armored orca glory days, this chunky placoderm used extensions of its jawbones to shear through the thick defenses of its prey with a force exceeding 7,000 newtons. But the really scary thing was how quickly it did so. Dunkleosteus could open and close its jaws faster than a human eye can blink, creating a powerful suction force that could draw prey towards it and snap them in half like cookies. Even if you can outswim it, it's probably still catching you. That's a 3 for its speed. Back on land, we find a number of saber-toothed taxa throughout prehistory. The Gorgonopsids are among the earliest and most famous. Just look at Innistransevia, for example. Take the best parts of a wolf and a hypercarnivorous lizard, give it saber teeth, and you basically have the perfect animal. That's an 8, for not being big enough to bite you in half, but just the right size to eat your guts out while you're still alive. Their fellow therapsids, the Therocephalians, were much smaller, but made up for it with evidence for venom in animals like Garcia. That's maybe a 7? We don't know how potent the venom would have been, but getting gnawed alive would hurt quite a bit. True mammals picked up the saber-tooth game later on, including the Cretaceous Cronopio, 10 for the Ice Age memes, and the saber-toothed cats like Smilodon. The killer kitty gets an 8 for suffocating you with a throat bite and bleeding you to death simultaneously. Carnivores weren't the only ones to develop saber teeth either. The Permian herbivore Tiara jutans may have used its gnarly face knives to fight rivals like modern musk deer do. And a similar behavior is possible for the Cenozoic Uintatherium. We'll give both of them a cautious 4, since they were more likely to quickly trample you than kill you with toothy paper cuts. Let's take a break from teeth for a minute and look at beaks. The Phorusrhacids, or terror birds of the Cenozoic, were flightless theropods with massive beaks designed for crushing and gripping flesh. Getting your skull crushed by Trauma Big Bird is at least a 6. Giant Asdarchids like Quetzalcoatlus could have used their car-sized beaks to spear prey on the ground or swallow animals whole. The first would be a 6, the second would be a terrifying 9, and giant turtles like Archelon or Stupendemus could have easily severed human limbs through virtue of sheer size. The blood loss, shock, and stinging seawater give that dumb way to die a 7. Ancient cephalopods also had beaks, although made of chitin rather than bone, and the largest prehistoric variants like Encoteuthis would have had a mean bite. Getting torn apart by a beak and tentacles while underwater is one of my worst nightmares, so I'm giving it an automatic 10. I love giant squid, but there is nothing more terrifying to me. Except for a balloon popping while you're blowing it up. That's an 11. And back to teeth. There's just so much to cover. Pliosaurs like Kronosaurus had some of the most terrifying jaws in natural history, with a skull over 9 feet long from the largest specimen. An 8.6 meter individual had a bite force between 15,000 and 27,000 newtons, so you can imagine how hard the biggest ones would have bitten down. This would be pretty much immediate death, with a 3 on the torture scale. Another tool that would have helped to down aquatic prey is the pterygoid tooth row found in mosasaurs. These are extra teeth on the roof of the mouth, and would have strengthened the mosasaur's ability to grip prey while biting down, stopping their struggling victims from escaping. 2 bites for the price of 1? That's a 7 for sure. Some of the most fearsome teeth in the Mesozoic belong to the giant raptorial ichthyosaur Himalayasaurus, which sported curved, laterally compressed cutting teeth like spearheads. It was a monster at 30 to 35 tons and over 15 meters long, making it one of the largest macropredators in history. Even larger cutting teeth have been uncovered from the Swiss Alps, implying an even more massive superpredatory ichthyosaur. Similar to the giant pliosaurs, this would be over before you could even process it. 3. Fish didn't slack off during the Mesozoic either. Cephactinus, the bulldog fish, had a mean face and a meaner bite, swallowing human-sized prey animals whole, and choking to death. Getting swallowed alive is still a 9. Tychodus was an enormous ammonite and turtle-crushing lamniform shark. At up to 10 meters long for the biggest specimens, it would have been able to chomp down on most of the shelled organisms in its Cretaceous environment. Its plate-like teeth weren't sharp, but they had serious power behind them. A hydraulic press can still kill you, and wouldn't be too quick about it. 7. Even earlier, the Permian giant Helicoprion used a funky tooth whorl to slice and crush soft-bodied prey like cephalopods. It looks like something George Lucas would have cooked up on acid. This would take some weird biting angles to fully kill you and would probably hurt for a long time. That's another 7. Let's give the mammals some love. Andrewsarchus is only known from skull material and teeth, but what great big teeth it has, all the better to gobble up whatever it wanted. Look at how ridiculously massive this thing is compared to the skull of a brown bear, Masonics, and wolf. Andrewsarchus was in a different league from the majority of mammalian predators, rivaled only by the enormous hyaenodontid Megastotherium. A bite from either of these is a painful 6. Continuing the mammals in the tooth category are the proboscidans, whose enormous tusks are technically teeth. All stars like Zygolophodon would have been able to use their relatively straight, strong tusks in combat, while builds more similar to the Columbian mammoth used their curved tusks as digging tools to help find buried roots and tubers, although they'd still be savage weapons to any animals rhino-sized or smaller that could get trapped between them. That includes humans, and would likely be fast, but impalement is no joke. 6. Finishing up teeth is our friend from Madagascar, Mexicosaurus. There's no denying that Mexicosaurus is bizarre, but its outwardly curved teeth were a perfect adaptation for capturing fish in Cretaceous Madagascar. It also hurt like heck as it sliced you to ribbons with its small skull. 8. Moving on to our second category of prehistoric weaponry, claws and pincers. Perhaps some of the most famous claws in Earth's violent history belong to the Segnosaur Therizinosaurus, a Mongolian giant who makes Edward Scissorhands feel like a normal person. Recent studies indicate that its claws may have been decorative, perhaps as a tool for intimidation given how thin they were. I don't know about you, but I'd be plenty intimidated if I saw a 6-ton theropod with scythe fingers walking in the woods. It's the next logical step in the evolution of salad fingers, I suppose. While they weren't designed for combat, they'd easily disembowel or decapitate a human. 5. Then there's Sauropods, a gigantic Jurassic theropod closely related to Allosaurus. With multiple specimens in the 5-ton range and fragmentary remains indicating much larger individuals, it would have used these hook claws to grab onto unfortunate sauropods and thyreophorans and disembowel them as they struggled to flee. Getting eaten alive after being stabbed? That's an 8 for sure. Speaking of claws, check out this awesome giant bear. Arctodus simus was a huge omnivore that lived in North America until about 13,000 years ago, and it was packed to the brim with firepower. Take the 1800s mountain man stories about grizzlies decapitating moose with one hit, scale that up to 900 kilos, and you've got yourself a real monster that earns a merciful 4. But bears weren't the only mammals with scary claws. Look at Megatherium and other ground sloths for a masterclass in the subject. The biggest ground sloth genera reached over 5 metric tons, making them comparable to African elephants, and essentially had bulldozers attached to their arms? Huge tunnels have been found in South America believed to have either been dug or altered by ground sloths, so their claws were practical for obtaining shelter in addition to defense and foraging. You'd be crushed pretty much instantly, so the big sloth gets a 3. Haast's eagle was an absolutely enormous bird that lived in New Zealand until 600 years ago. At up to 18 kilograms, it hunted the terrestrial moa and used its huge talons to grip onto and mutilate its prey. I'm giving this an 8. The bird's agility and razor claws would mess you up in an agonizing death. That tactic is reminiscent of a different type of raptor that lived much earlier. Dromaeosaurs were originally theorized to use their killing claws to gut open their victims, but are now thought to have used them to pin animals in place during the killing and feeding process. The largest dromaeosaur known from good remains, Utahraptor, had a killing claw up to 24 centimeters long, or 9.5 inches. Like snacks, it earns an 8 for likely eating you alive. The Carcharodontosaurid Meraxes had a similar, albeit much smaller proportionally, adaptation on its feet, likely used to hold down dying sauropods as it ate them alive. Seems to be a theme, another 8. Many terror birds also possess sickle claws, a throwback to their dromaeosaur relatives, and probably employed the same tactic, so yet another 8. And now for something completely different. Huge invertebrates once ruled the world's oceans, with the 2-foot radiodont Anomalocaris serving as an apex predator during the Cambrian. Its raptorial appendages would have been used to snatch up soft-bodied prey in the water column, piercing them and bringing them closer to its disc-like mouth. Getting torn apart little bits at a time and then shoved into the biological equivalent of a garbage disposal is not for me. I'm giving this fella a 9. The Tully monster is another weirdo from the Paleozoic. Tully monstrum is some kind of animal. We still don't really understand what this thing was, but it ranged from 3 to 14 inches or 8 to 35 centimeters in body length. It was equipped with a grasping proboscis-like claw on its face? To smaller animals, this would have been an apocalypse beast straight out of the early 2000s re-release of Return of the Jedi. Just because of that musical number, I'm giving this an 8, although frankly we don't know enough about this little critter to give it a real ranking. So if Tully monstrum is giving weird musical numbers nobody asked for, eurypterids like Jaculateris are the sarlacc. Absolutely gargantuan chelicerates with a max length of over 2.5 meters, or 8.5 feet, their pincers were a death sentence to any small animals in their Devonian ecosystem, and would be a torturous 7 for a human. It's frankly a miracle that Nigel Marvin is still alive after tangling with smaller eurypterids and chased by sea monsters. Man, what a great show. They should make a sequel with an Ichthyotitan episode. Speaking of Ichthyotitan, my short story Shipbreaker is out now. It launches the Extinction Universe, an alternate Earth where warriors from ancient civilizations form psychic bonds with prehistoric life. You can download it for free by signing up for my newsletter using the link in the description. Megaraptorans are another Freddy Krueger-like dinosaur. Typified by Megaraptor, this group of theropods had wicked curved claws on their hands and remain of uncertain phylogenetic position relative to other theropods. They might be tyrannosauroids of some kind, but we're not really sure yet since most of them are highly fragmentary. But a proper goring by large claws is a 6 at least. Bridging the gap between categories is Iguanodon, with its iconic thumb spike. This robust weapon could have been used for foraging hard nuts and seeds, as well as defense against any theropods foolish enough to attack this 4-ton ornithopod from the front. One hit from this would pretty much rip off a human's head, so I'll give it a 4. It's not technically a claw, but it kind of functions as one, so it brings us to spikes. Some of the first things we can kind of call spikes belong to trilobites, which as they evolved gained ever more elaborate defensive structures. Some I'm sure were for display rather than protection, but hey, multitasking is a thing. They'd be hard-pressed to kill a human, but I imagine an inexplicably bloodthirsty swarm of hundreds crawling over a diver and both cutting and suffocating them, which to me is a 9. Hallucigenia is another freakishly bizarre Cambrian beastie that walked on soft, thin legs and kept a back covered in spikes aimed at any predators trying to sneak up on it from above. It took a long time for us to figure out which end was the top and which was the bottom, thanks to even the most well-preserved specimens looking like a 4-year-old was told to draw a snake that had swallowed a cactus. This is maybe at 7? It could crawl up your nose and stab you. I don't know, I'm completely making that up. Perhaps the most famous spikes in prehistory belong to the stegosaurs. They're called thagomizers, after the iconic Far Side comic, in which a caveman was brutally murdered by a stegosaur tail spike. The longest thagomizers belonged to Alcovosaurus / Miragaia / Dustentruris, and were nearly a meter long, or just over 3 feet. Thagomizers have been found to match deep puncture wounds in Allosaurus vertebrae, demonstrating their piercing power, and biomechanical models of Kentrosaurus indicate a disturbingly wide effective range for these vicious spikes. I do not envy any theropod caught on the business end of an upset stegosaur. The horrible thing is that fossils indicate that theropods sometimes survived the initial wound but then died of infection weeks later, making those cases a drawn-out, painful affair that earns a 9. Nothing like living through a stab wound until you don't. I also don't envy any theropods trying to bite a Gastonia. This nodosaur maxed out its defense stat when building its character, and in addition to thick armor plates was covered with thorny spines from neck to tail. The idea of it leveraging its spikes as scissors is patently ridiculous, but it's a serious defensive system nonetheless, and getting rammed with a shoulder spike would mortally wound a person, but maybe not kill them right away. 7. And yes, prehistoric porcupines like Erythis and Poyuri also existed. We don't know much about them, but they probably had quills as well. Porcupine quills are remarkably painful and difficult to remove, so dying from an overabundance of them in your skin would be pretty bad. 6, possibly higher. Our next category, horns, domes, and rams, starts off with the charismatic and adorable Pachycephalosaurs, whose reinforced skull roofs were likely used for ramming. This certainly would have been helpful as an intimidation display against predators as well. There's nothing quite like saying, "Watch it, pal, I can break your ribcage with my hairline." Pachycephalosaurs were just the ornithischian equivalent of Vegeta. Maybe they had the attitude to match. 5. Ancient rhinos were not afraid to go to extremes in the pursuit of self-defense. Even if Elasmotherium had a proportionally small horn, as recent studies suggest, it was still fully capable of goring anything around its own size. Coelodonta's front horn was monstrous, around 4 feet long for bigger individuals, and would have dissuaded any predators in the area from trying their luck. Both of these would be close to one-hit kills for a human. They score a 3, unless they gore you and leave you there, which would bring up the score considerably. Of course, the OG masters of excessively large facial horns were the ceratopsians. While it's tragic that ceratopsian postcrania is generally poorly known, their skulls were fascinating and incredibly diverse. We see varying numbers of horns along with a variety of decorative shield horns, which likely served multiple roles including intraspecific communication, defense, and intimidation. Triceratops brow horns can reach up to a meter long and are affectionately known as eyebrow swords. If they hit your brain or heart, it's a 2. If not, you might be left dangling there and suffer a 9. Horns weren't the only tool in a ceratopsian's face, however. Some also developed massive, flat bosses that would have been useful for ramming and pushing other large animals, whether that be rivals for mates or would-be predators who woke up on the wrong side of the herbivorous spike dragon. Pachyrhinosaurus exemplifies this trait. Plus, it's a beautiful animal and my favorite ceratopsian, so I exhort you to appreciate its centrosaurine majesty. If it crushed you against a brick wall, I'd give it a 4. Our final category contains perhaps the most devastating weapons pound for pound in the dinosaurian lineage: tails. Specifically, tail clubs. While some groups of dinosaurs made a token effort at the whack-a-mole build, like the small sauropod Shunosaurus, it was the ankylosaurids that took this idea and turned it into a martial art. Stegosaurus was an ankylosaurid from Cretaceous Chile that was kind of a morphological mixture of typical ankylosaurids and stegosaurids, with its tail resembling a maquith made of osteoderms. It could have used it as a sharpened bat to ward off enemies, and look how cute it is. I would definitely want one as a pet, even if I had to wear shin guard 24/7. A blow from this would break your legs and leave you stranded there to starve in horrible pain, so this little guy takes home an 8. Of course, the most iconic ankylosaurid was Ankylosaurus itself, a 3 to 5-ish ton stout herbivore with armor up to the wazoo and a tail club built like a wrecking ball. With only a 45-degree angle of flexure on either side, it wasn't nearly as versatile as Kentrosaurus, but one hit would shatter the ankles of most potential threats and blast apart a human, giving it a 2. But even Ankylosaurus didn't have the most devastating club tail design within its own family. That title arguably goes to Anodontosaurus, a 2-ton tomahawk on 4 legs. Its more spike-shaped club would have focused the force on a smaller area, so although it had less absolute power than its larger relative, it would have been a serious damage dealer. That's another 2. The Glyptodont Didacurus had a tail sheathed in protective bone as well as a hefty club with massive spikes, the disco ball of death. One hit from this and anything smaller than a rhino is full of holes and about to die. That's a 4. And the elephants in the room when it comes to tails are, of course, the giant sauropods. The debate on whether or not sauropods could have used their tails as whips goes back and forth in literature, but Daniel Vidal has indicated that recent studies poo-pooing the idea severely underestimated the flexibility and strength of sauropod tails, as well as bullwhip physics in general, so I wouldn't count out the possibility. A tail hitting a theropod's ribcage at nearly the speed of sound would certainly get damaged, but it would also break bone and tear muscle, not to mention scare the crap out of any other predators that may be watching. It would be too fast for a human being to even feel, so getting blasted to bits by a sauropod tail is the first true mercy killing on this list. Thank you for joining me on this shallow and a little awesome bro, but hopefully educational overview on the weaponry of extinct animals. There is always more that could be covered, so if I missed your favorite examples of crazy bioweapons, drop them in the comments so we can all be enlightened. Make sure to check out previous videos on the channel and subscribe so you don't miss further analysis. Joining the channel gets you various perks including shoutouts, and Megatheropod and Megasauropod members get early access to videos. I'm the Vividen, and I'll see you next time.